Well, good morning, and to all of those who are following us online, good afternoon or good evening from wherever you are watching from. It's great to see such a good turnout today. This morning, I'm Jenny Town. I'm a senior fellow here at the Stimson Center and director of our Korea program and 38 North. I'm pleased to co-host this book talk today along with our partners at the National Committee on North Korea, Institute for Science and International Security, and the Arms Control Association. And I would like to thank them all, especially Keith Luce, David Albright, and Daryl Kimball, for their support of this event. And on behalf of all of our co-hosts, we want to congratulate Joel on his new book. So for those of you who don't know us, Joel and I have been working together for something like 18 years now. First at the U.S. Korea Institute at Johns Hopkins SAIS, where we started 38 North together back in 2010. We then moved over here to the Stimson Center in 2018, and he's been working on this book for the last several years. So it's great to see it finally in print, and it's particularly meaningful right now. And of course, the timing couldn't be better. With Trump in the region right now, hinting at hopes that Kim Jong-un might agree to meet him to kickstart another round of U.S. DPRK relations and diplomacy. While that seems kind of a long shot at the moment, there have been overtures from Pyongyang that reviving diplomacy is possible when the time is right and a new agenda is clear. All that to say, now is an opportune time to really take a look back at where we've been, what worked, what didn't work, and reflect on the implications for future talks. So with us today, of course, is Joel Wit, a distinguished fellow here at the Stimson Center with our Korea program and 38 North, and author, of course, of the new book, if you don't have a copy, Fallout, the inside story of America's failure to disarm North Korea. He has spent several years in the policy community here and is well known for his expertise on Asian security affairs. He's a former State Department official where he also served as the implementation coordinator for the agreed framework. He also co-authored with Robert Gallucci and Dan Poneman, Going Critical, the first North Korean nuclear crisis, really chronicling the origins of this North Korea denuclearization saga. We're also pleased to have today Nick Schifrin, who you might know from PBS's NewsHour, where he serves as the Foreign Affairs and Defense correspondent, leading NewsHour's daily foreign coverage. His work has won a number of awards over the years, too many to list right now, but including the American Academy of Diplomacy's Arthur Ross Media Award for Distinguished Reporting and Analysis of Foreign Affairs. So lately, he's been doing some in-depth, on-the-ground reporting about the war in Ukraine. So we're incredibly fortunate that he could spare some time and join us today to lead this timely and engaging discussion. So we do plan to take a couple of questions from the audience after their talk and in the latter half of the hour. So for those of you who are online, there are instructions on how to post questions. Please feel free to post questions at any time and we'll work them into the mix when we get to that. And with that, I would like to hand it over to Nick.
Jenny, thank you so much, Joel. It's a pleasure to be here with you, and it's a pleasure to see a lot of familiar faces, including some that I haven't seen in a while, and welcome all on TV and online. And perhaps the best compliment I can give you, Joel, is that your book is a book that a journalist can be jealous of.
Wow.
Because
Much appreciated.
Because it feels not just like an analysis, but of course an insider's account of the last few decades. So well done.
Yes, and that's exactly what I was aiming for. So yeah. Thank you very much.
So let's do two broad questions that I think will set out a framework for the entire discussion. We'll go through from the agreed framework all the way to today, and then we'll open it up in the last 20 minutes or so for questions. So let me start with a big question here. You write in the preface, true, the North Koreans see those nuclear weapons as the ultimate guarantor of their survival, but they have also been willing to give them up in return for better relations with the United States. Why do you believe it was possible, and perhaps still is possible, to get denuclearization?
Well, people have this misconception about the North Koreans, that they're driven by ideology. But in fact, they are driven by geopolitics. And so when you look at the time period from before the agreed framework, the Soviet Union collapsed. China was reaching out to South Korea. And the North Koreans, confronted with that situation, decided they would turn to the United States and try to build a better relationship. And the nuclear weapons were on the negotiating table. It was very telling, because every time North Korean officials visited New York later on, they would always want to meet with Henry Kissinger, even though he considered bombing them when he was in the Nixon White House. And that was because he was the grand master of geopolitics.
Okay, there are some who would argue this is not only about regime survival, these nuclear weapons and these missiles, but about hostile intent.
Well, the problem here all along for 30 years has been, first of all, the North Koreans had trouble switching from hostility towards the United States towards accommodation with the United States. And so, you know, every once in a while you'd get a provocation. But secondly, they didn't know whether it was going to work out. You know, after decades of hostility. So they had to decide, well, let's keep these things as a hedge until we see what happens with diplomacy. And, you know, maybe, and as we've seen, diplomacy didn't work out, but they have themselves protected.
And we'll tease, not yet, well, we'll leave that as a tease as to whether you think diplomacy still could work today for the end. All right, let's go back to 94. And as we mentioned, the agreed framework signed in 1994. Why, and you just mentioned this a little bit, but why did North Korea want to reach out after the end of the Cold War, but also simultaneously be willing to take a step like leaving the NPT?
Well, for precisely the reasons I just mentioned. And in fact, we have information that they made a decision in the late 1980s, early 1990s, to do exactly what they did. They decided, look, this isn't working out with the Soviet Union. We don't know what's going to happen with China. We need to protect ourselves. And when they thought protect ourselves, I think that was largely because on their border was China. And so they reached out to the United States, and they knew ahead of time that we were going to ask them to give up their nuclear weapons. And, you know, we succeeded in the agreed framework. Why they left the NPT and then suspended it, I think that was just a tactical step.
Got it. You make a strong argument that after all of these years with the NPT, and we don't have to rehash all the history, whether North Korea cheated, et cetera, but you go to 2000, and I want you to examine this, the end of the Clinton presidency, and he is dangled two options in December and January, how to spend his time. Does he go to North Korea? Does he try and solve North Korea? Or does he try and solve Middle East peace? He's actually talked about this as well, and you quote him. But you make a strong argument that history would have been different had he spent his final days working on a deal with North Korea. Why?
Yeah, I really believe that, because I think Kim Jong-il was seriously interested in this different relationship with the United States. And he even said to Madeleine Albright when she was there was, you know, if we're friends, we don't need these weapons anymore. So I think he was seriously interested in it. The problem, of course, was that, you know, Clinton would have gone there without a deal done.
Right.
And no one was willing to let him do that. On the other hand, you know, the Middle East deal wasn't done either.
Right.
But he went ahead and did that, and of course it didn't work out.
But a lack of imagination, perhaps? You think that in retrospect, had he said no, let's just go and see what happens, North Korea would have been willing to take the steps it would have had to take?
You know, I don't want to be unfair to people. I wouldn't say it was a lack of imagination, because some American experts on North Korea said, you know, if he goes to Pyongyang, there's going to be a deal, because they knew the North Koreans wouldn't have him there and then stiff him. But, you know, after all those years of hostility, it was hard to send an American president off to North Korea. And indeed, when he finally went to North Korea in 2009,
Right.
a number of U.S. government officials were afraid that he was going to be taken hostage.
Well, they also told him not to smile, as you.
Well, they also told him not to smile, but
right.
you know, so Clinton's delegation had to check in with Washington regularly,
Yeah.
just to say everything is okay here.
Yeah. All right. So Bush administration, they initially ditched the agreed framework, of course. They tried to resurrect it in the second term. In retrospect, what do you think the legacy of the six-party talks was, if anything?
You know, this is a very good question. I think the Bush administration was obviously another big turning point, because during the first term, they trashed the agreed framework. It collapsed. And the second term, they tried to reconstruct it through the six-party talks. Obviously, that didn't work, but I think if you had to look back, you would say better to have the six-party talks than to have no talks at all. So in a way, it established a floor for subsequent U.S. administrations to try to build on. And as we see, that really didn't happen.
You write that at the end of the Bush administration, the United States was less safe. And that's demonstrably true if just only judging North Korea by its nuclear capabilities and missile inventory. In retrospect, by the time you get to January 2009, when Obama becomes president, had there been a different alternative? Was there a different path that the Bush administration could have taken?
Well, you know what happened at the end of the Bush administration? I mean, they were on a fairly decent path, but at the end, Kim Jong-il had a stroke. And of course, on the North Korean side, that certainly froze what they were willing to do, and it even hardened up their positions. And at the end of the Bush administration, there was a little bit of a comeback by Dick Cheney, who was pushing for much harder positions with the North Koreans. So the combination of the two basically froze the negotiation and left it for Obama to figure out what to do.
Much of the book is an indictment, if I could use that word, of President Obama's attempts and President Trump's attempts for very different reasons. And so let's take some time to talk about Obama first and then Trump. You write that Obama thought he had time on his side. Why did he not have time on his side in retrospect?
Well, there was, as I said in the book, there are two schools of thought. There were a lot of experts who said, you don't have time on your side. Kim Jong-il just had a stroke. We don't know what's coming next.
There was a real doubt about stability.
There was a real doubt about what was happening and who might take over and what position they would take. On the other hand, there were people who said, well, they're unstable now, they're going to be weak, and we can get a better deal from them. On top of that, it's undeniable that when President Obama took office, he and his aides were very skeptical about even dealing with North Korea. And there's a story about a couple of briefings by the Director of National Intelligence, and one of them was with Susan Rice and some others. And it was very negative on the North Koreans, particularly the uranium enrichment program. And so Susan Rice came out of the meeting and tongue-in-cheek said, so John Bolton was right? So I think that only added to the skepticism of dealing with North Korea.
The irony of basically the disdain that you write about, of course, is that Obama pursued talks with Iran.
Yes, and he pursued them vigorously. So, when the 2009 deal with Iran collapsed, they started a secret channel of talks. Yeah. With North Korea, when the Obama administration's Leap Day deal collapsed, there wasn't a serious effort to salvage it.
Before the Leap Day deal, of course, the Obama administration embraces strategic patience. You write, that was an attitude, not a policy. What do you mean?
Well, it started off that some people in the Obama administration really wanted to put the pedal to the metal with North Korea. And, You know, Rahm Emanuel, I won't use the four-letter words he used, but he really wanted to
Four-letter words for Rahm are like commas and periods. Yeah.
I know. Well, he wanted to really, you know, go after North Korea, but instead, the administration adopted this policy of gradual escalation of sanctions. You know, maybe we'll talk to them, maybe we won't. And so it was a combination of very little pressure and very little diplomacy. And at that point in time, it may have seemed like, okay, this is good enough, because the North Korean program hadn't expanded. But over time, it was obvious it wasn't working.
Yeah, and you also write the sanctions strategy was doomed to fail. Why?
It was doomed to fail because, you know, the North Koreans, this is a repeated mistake by the United States, which is we think that we can change countries and how they view their national interests. And the North Koreans weren't going to change their national interest just because of some limited sanctions on their WMD program. So that was a big reason of why it didn't work, but implementation wasn't very good. The sanctions effort started out okay, but then by the end of the administration, by the end of the first term, it petered out. And, you know, the diplomacy, well, that didn't work. And I think you'll get to the Leap Day deal. That didn't work either. That was ill-conceived and not well executed.
Well, why don't we jump there? Well, let me ask about Bill Clinton's trip, because I think it's fascinating. So as you mentioned before, they reluctantly send former President Clinton in 2009. And they, you know, this whole briefing, it's fantastic. You know, Bill, don't smile. Okay, you can smile at the end, you know, et cetera. But you point out that it was a missed opportunity, that he could have gone there with a different briefing and a different opening. Why could he have opened up something if the administration had been willing to let him?
It's funny you mentioned the story about not smiling, because when he was at home, he practiced not smiling in front of a mirror and had his wife and daughter watching. And then when he succeeded in retrieving the two journalists and was, you know, they were going up the, whatever, to the plane, he turned around and smiled.
Yeah.
So, you know, it was hard for him not to smile. But, you know, the problem was it was hard for the administration to send Clinton off.
Because of the Jimmy Carter incident.
Because of Jimmy Carter, and also because Hillary had been a rival of Obama's during the primaries. So it was hard for them to send him off. Yeah. They tied his hands because they didn't want a repetition of Jimmy Carter. And so, you know, he wasn't Jimmy Carter. He followed his instructions. But he was very sophisticated in how he sort of led the North Koreans to say things that indicated they wanted a deal.
They were certainly open to talking again.
Very open to a deal. Kim Jong-il was very open to a deal. Even floated the idea of a missile test moratorium with Clinton. Clinton came back, briefed the president, his staff briefed the White House staff, and they all said, look, there's a deal to be had here. And if you think about it, if Clinton had been given some leeway, you know, things would have been much further along than just an impression that there could be a deal.
Leap year agreement signed in 2012 is about 2.5 years after that. As you said, collapsed after a few weeks. Why?
Well, there are a number of reasons why, and I'm not sure, most people may not remember the Leap Day deal that well. But it was
North Korea experts, I think they know what we're talking about.
It was essentially, and I was really shocked when one of the White House staff said to me, we wanted to reach a gentleman's agreement with North Korea. And I thought, are you kidding me? A gentleman's agreement with a country you've been accusing of cheating for years. But this was the approach. And so what did that mean? It meant the deal wasn't written down on one piece of paper for both sides to look over and agree to. It was separate press releases. And each side could write their own press release based on negotiations. So right away, you know, even before I even talk about the substance, that's a big problem. Second problem is that they, I don't want to say fired, but they let go their most experienced negotiator before the negotiations took off. And by that I mean Steve Bosworth, who had years of experience dealing with the North Koreans. And it was clear the negotiations were going to become serious. They let him go. There are a lot of different interpretations for that, but I know he wasn't happy. So that's number two. They had inexperienced people, good diplomats, but inexperienced people negotiating the deal. Number three, just to make this very quick, the big issue was whether space launch vehicles would be included in the test moratorium, because those vehicles could be used to develop long-range missiles. North Koreans wouldn't agree to do that on paper. So we ended up using a unilateral assertion by the United States that they would include space launch vehicles in the agreement. So, you know, the negotiators bounced this off the North Koreans, and they would shake their heads and make reassuring noises. But in fact, you know, within a few weeks of the agreement being reached, it collapsed because the North Koreans announced they were going to test a space launch vehicle. So for all of those reasons, I'm all for diplomacy, but, you know, this was an ill-conceived effort, and the North Koreans took advantage of it.
So keeping our accelerated pace of history here, a few years later, Obama makes a decision, and this is one of the fascinating things that I'm not sure I knew before, at least certainly not in this detail. Obama turns to the Pentagon and says, what about a preemptive strike? So why did he say that, and what was the response?
Well, this was in 2014, and it was very clear by then. We're into the second term, but even at the end of the first term of the administration, it was very clear that the North Korean missile program was literally taking off. You know, in 2012, they paraded a mobile ICBM in Pyongyang, which set off a lot of alarm bells. So in 2014, given that this program was moving forward, Obama did turn to the Pentagon and said, give me a plan for a preemptive strike, not because he was planning on launching it. As Trump later claimed, Obama was going to start a war. He wanted the option available for future presidents. And indeed, Obama would turn to some of his aides at times and say, I can envision a time when a future U.S. president will need this plan. Pentagon, you know, they worked on it, but it's very difficult to put together a preemptive strike against mobile missiles. They came back and said to Obama, we're not sure we can get all of them. And on top of that, North Korea may start a second Korean War if we try it. And Obama wasn't happy. He said, I was told, he said to his aides, if we can find Osama bin Laden, why can't we find North Korean mobile missiles? And at the end of the administration, I think they made progress, but still wasn't at a point where it was a workable plan.
Let me ask it to you a little differently. If the Pentagon says we can't get the mobile missiles, sir, does that mean essentially the request, regardless of whether he was going to use it, came in too late? Meaning, had there been an opportunity for that plan to be workable before that point at all? Or by the time Obama asks, nobody could have come up with a plan?
Well, that's a good point. You know, in the 6 years before he asked, if there had been active diplomacy, if there had been a test ban, if there had been other measures that we started to get a grip on the North Korean WMD programs, then that whole episode may have been avoided.
All right, so Mr. Trump arrives, and I'm going to skip all the way to the Hanoi summit because I want to spend some time on that. So let's not forget the fire and fury and all of that. But you argue that they get through Singapore, that summit, and they get to the Hanoi summit, and they come closer to an agreement than most people today certainly think that they did. So talk about that. Why do you think they were closer to an agreement? And why do you think that, as you write, Trump and Kim couldn't cross that final bridge of how much denuclearization for how much sanctions relief?
Yeah, it's very interesting. Let me try to summarize that viewpoint. First, it's not common knowledge, but there was almost a 10-page summit document negotiated by Steve Biegun and the North Koreans right before the summit. It resolved every issue that had been under discussion between the United States and North Korea for decades. Everything from establishing diplomatic relations to starting peace treaty negotiations, exchanging people-to-people exchanges, on and on and on. And the two issues that were left were denuclearization and sanctions lifting. So they were on the verge of something really significant. Secondly, in the summit itself, the idea that Trump was pushing for some big deal of denuclearization is wrong. He was not pushing for a big deal. And, for months, the U.S. position had been evolving, largely because of Steve Biegun's work, to a step-by-step road to denuclearization, starting with a focus on the Yongbyon nuclear facility, dismantling that. And that's what Trump really pushed at the summit. And Kim Jong-un was also pushing a deal, dismantling Yongbyon in return for lifting all American sanctions. That was too much. So Trump, and if you read John Bolton's book, you'll see it's there. Trump was saying, well, gee, maybe we can lift fewer sanctions, or maybe you can dismantle more of your facilities. And Kim Jong-un wouldn't budge. So what happened was Trump decided, I'm out of here. He decided to walk out. And while that is in process, Steve Biegun and a senior North Korean official were in a hallway continuing negotiations. And the negotiations were making progress. But as they were talking, Trump walked by, going out the door, and Biegun had to follow him. So they cut it all short. Last point I want to make, and I can't get myself into the mind of Donald Trump, but as Air Force One was leaving, the first phone call Trump made was to President Moon Jae-in of South Korea. And he said to President Moon, and he said this 7 times, get in contact with Kim Jong-un and see how he's feeling about the failed summit. And there's one story, and I think it's true, that after Trump walked out, Kim was really angry, went back to his hotel room, and people heard him slam the door. So it was very close. If Trump hadn't left, if he had stayed for the whole summit, who knows what would have happened.
But let me push you on this, because perhaps it's conventional wisdom, but I think some of Trump's advisors, even to this day, tell me this, and I understand you think Bolton's influence was lower, so advisors other than Bolton think that it was still a bad deal, and that Kim was robotic and wouldn't budge, and that Trump tried to shake things up by walk out, and, well, maybe you think that's too late, but nothing was budging on the North Korean side, and so it was a bad deal, so Trump was right to walk out.
Well, there was budging going on, because the person Steve was talking to was Chae Sun-hee, and as Steve negotiated with her, and she didn't know the answers to some of the questions he was asking her, she said, wait a minute. She went back to the North Korean meeting room and probably was meeting with Kim Jong-un and asking him, what are the answers to these questions? She would come back, give Steve the answers, and Steve, you know, he was very pleasantly surprised because he had been asking these same questions for months, and no one on the North Korean side would answer him. You know, as for whether the focus on Yeonbyeon was a bad deal or a good deal, most people don't realize that the Yeonbyeon that we negotiated on in 1993 was very different from the Yeonbyeon of 2019. There were new uranium, in addition to the plutonium production facilities, there were new uranium facilities, production facilities. There were probably other facilities that were new that produced materials that the North Koreans needed for hydrogen bombs. So this was a very different facility, and as a first step, I think it would have been pretty important.
And there could have been a first step, you suggest, of even lower, right? So it could have been less than dismantling and fewer sanctions. You think that would have been possible?
You know, Trump didn't go lower, and you know, I hesitate to say I would have gone lower. He stuck with Yeonbyeon because that's what Kim offered. But he was trying to get Kim to move on the sanctions issue or to give more on the nuclear issue.
So I've got 6 or 7 minutes left, which brings us to today. So you look back and you argue, as you just did, that President Trump walked out of Hanoi. You also say that he lied to Kim in Singapore. So is that how you see it? And does that mean that North Korea is not going to be willing to sit down with Donald Trump again?
Just a small correction. He lied to Kim at the DMZ side.
Sorry, at the DMZ, sorry. Right.
About canceling the upcoming exercise, which went ahead.
Got it, sorry.
You know, the North Korea today is very different from the North Korea in 2019. I am convinced that back then Kim Jong-un was serious about engagement, about working with the United States. There are lots of indicators of that. The North Korea today, obviously, is now a close ally of Russia and China. It's a hostile relationship with the United States. His country is much stronger today, not just in terms of, you know, the WMD programs. They're modernizing their conventional forces. Their economy isn't doing too badly. And Kim is looking, his objectives are different. He wants to become a player on the global stage. And he's also got a very hostile relationship with South Korea today. There are some experts who think that Kim is preparing for war. I don't know if I'd go that far, but the point here is that putting President Trump in a room with Kim Jong-un today was risky in the past, even when Kim was interested in a better relationship. I think it's even riskier today because Kim is going to start floating initiatives like, hey, Donald, why don't you withdraw your troops from the Korean Peninsula? And these are things that, you know, Trump may say, yeah, I've wanted to do that for a long time. But Kim's objectives here are very different.
Among the possible steps you think, or you talk about, that President Trump could take, it might take a U.S.-Russia deal over the war in Ukraine. But you also say that private letters, phone calls could shake up diplomacy.
Well, I think it has to be a combination of measures. It can't just be Trump writing one of his love letters to Kim saying, let's meet. There have got to be multiple steps. And one of the big steps here is that Trump needs to figure out how to get Russia and China to at least support some re-engagement with North Korea, because we'll go back to the geopolitics. You know, these are Kim's two major allies now. If they start nudging him saying, look, things are getting out of hand on the Korean Peninsula, you need to sit down with Trump and try to calm things down, he's going to take that into serious consideration.
Do you think the focus should continue to be denuclearization, or Secretary of State Rubio in his confirmation hearing suggested a kind of risk reduction strategy?
Yeah, definitely. I think Secretary Rubio was right on the money. And this is no revelation. I think almost everyone believes denuclearization is just not going to be in the cards. And the trick here is, and once again, this takes some fancy footwork, how not to recognize North Korea as a nuclear power. Just to say, yes, we know they have nuclear weapons, but don't go any further than that, because that could trigger a response, certainly in South Korea, which has been all along considering either asking us to bring back tactical nuclear weapons. And they did that at the end of the Park administration, or build their own. So it's going to take fancy footwork. I'm not sure President Trump is going to be able to do that.
And so when he suggests and I counted this 6 times in 4 minutes on Air Force One, right, during a 32-minute gaggle with reporters, 6 times in 4 minutes he said, I'd love to meet Kim. I'd like to meet him. He's a great guy. I'd love to meet him. I'd love to meet him. If he's watching, I don't know. We're going to be there. He actually used the word hop, as in a reporter didn't let him finish the sentence, but the sentence begins, I could hop, suggesting that he could go across the border.
Well, this is another serious problem. You know, a SNAP summit may have had some effect in 2019, a bad effect, actually. But today, a SNAP summit could be a disaster because he won't be prepared. He won't have the same staff helping him with North Korea issues. There's no Steve Biegun. Even Mike Pompeo was helpful. There's no one like that today. And on top of that, Trump has said, gee, no one knows Kim better than I do. I don't need help. And so the combination of those things, I think, could spell a disaster.
And yet, what's the alternative?
Well, that's a good point. You know, I mean, if we're looking for a sophisticated approach to North Korea, I'm not sure I can be very positive.
Didn't expect to end on a downer like that, but it's a realistic one.
I always end on downers.
Exactly. All right, so we've gone through this very, very quickly, obviously. We have about 20 minutes, as predicted. I've got a series of questions that have come in online, but let me start in the room. Michael Gordon, please start us off. And there's a mic, so Michael, give us 1 second. And here you go.
There's 2 mics.
I don't need one.
You're on C-SPAN on the other one, Mike.
Okay. I'm Michael Gordon, Wall Street Journal. Joel, the judgment of the U.S. intelligence community, as you know, is stated in its Worldwide Threats report. The most recent one is Kim has no intention of negotiating away strategic weapons programs. And indeed, throughout the period where President Trump was trying to engage North Korea, that also was the assessment in ODNI. In fact, it infuriated Trump, and he complained about experts who he said didn't know better than he did. And I think lastly, the reason why Young may have been possible as an outcome in Hanoi, and I was there, was precisely because Kim was not going to give up his nuclear weapons. He was going to give up a complex. And at that stage of the game, if that deal had come together in return for sanctions relief and retained his enrichment program and his stock of weapons, and that would have been a subject for the future. So, Mike, following on Nick's last question, do you disagree with the U.S. intelligence community assessments that Kim doesn't want to give up his nuclear weapons? And then what would, beyond risk reduction, what would be a credible negotiating strategy? Wouldn't it be better, if it was at all achievable, to get a limit on North Korea's nuclear potential, but not an elimination of it? Isn't that the art of the possible? that in our political system, it's too much to ask for, but that seems to be all that is obtainable under the best of circumstances if you accept the intelligence community's view.
Well, do I disagree with the intelligence community? Yes, but with an asterisk. That has been the intelligence community's judgment ever since, 1990. And when we were doing the agreed framework, same thing. They're never going to give up this program. And, it continued on and on and on through the Obama administration into the Trump administration. And so I had a senior, I have to be careful, a senior White House official who had experience in the intelligence community during the Obama administration say to me, look, they told us the same thing about the Iran deal. Iran's never going to reach a deal. And so this person said, the hands-on experience is where we can get a real feel for what the other country is thinking. But today, yes, I think it's a no-brainer. They're not going to give these weapons up. I agree with you. If we adjusted our sights and tried for some sort of limited deal, whatever that might be, if we pulled the right levers, like getting Russia and China on board, then it might be possible. But I don't see us really doing that. And on top of that, it requires a level of, a reality check that I'm not sure we're capable of, because one of the problems all along has been that we had inflated expectations about what we might achieve with North Korea. And so I don't know if even the Trump administration is going to say, oh yeah, we're going to give up on denuclearization. It may be set in concrete.
I'm going to go to a few online questions. So if anybody in the room has any, start thinking. But that segues to a question submitted by Mark Tukola, retired Foreign Service officer. Have China and Russia wanted North Korean denuclearization? Could they have successfully applied more pressure or offered more incentives to help achieve that?
Part of the book is on Xi Jinping and the first years he was in power. And Americans were shocked by him because whenever they'd meet him, he was really down on Kim Jong-un. I mean, really down. And Americans thought, gee, maybe we can enlist this guy to put a lot more pressure on North Korea than any other Chinese leader. And at the Sunnyland Summit, he was down on Kim again. He kept repeating it. But afterwards, it became clear that whatever he was saying couldn't be translated into Chinese policy. There were limits on how far China would go to put pressure on North Korea. Now, I think the combination of Obama and Trump probably pushed them to the limit, but it wasn't enough. And they could never get China to really put down the hammer on North Korea, in part because China was always afraid of collapse.
Richard Kessler asked, do you see China as having more or less influence on North Korea today?
Oh, well, I think it's a lot less. I mean, the Chinese have never been willing to go as far with North Korea as the Russians are willing to do today. So, I mean, you can look at the breadth of Russian-North Korean relations, whether it's military, whether it's economic, and it's striking.
Well, to the point, Ukraine, that gets back to your point about Ukraine, right?
Yes,
in terms
yes.
of North Korean soldiers dying on the European continent on Russia's behalf.
Yes, and a friend of mine pointed out to me that when the North Korean soldiers who were in Ukraine marched in the recent parade in Pyongyang, they marched under the North Korean and Russian flags, which this person who has years of observing North Korea said it was unheard of.
Wai Chang sends in this question. What would be Kim Jong-un's course of action if President Trump were to agree to some of the policy changes that you fear he might, including retreating U.S. forces in Korea?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I'm not willing to go as far as some people in saying he's preparing for a war, but it's very clear that Kim Jong-un is embarked on a course of action that is strengthening his conventional forces. So if you throw into the mix his hostility towards North Korea, what would happen if tomorrow the U.S. started to withdraw forces from South Korea? I'm not sure what Kim would do. He's not going to just start a war, but I think it would certainly embolden him. And on top of that, I'm not sure what South Korea would do. And, you know, so it's probably a risk we don't want to take.
But are there moves that President Trump could take that wouldn't embolden Kim, as you just suggested, but instead encourage him to deal with Trump?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things Trump needs to do in South Korea, at least, is, you know, to strengthen deterrence, to strengthen our military posture there, to do it with the idea that, you know, maybe Kim is edging in the wrong direction. And also another thing is, I know the North Koreans are studying the lessons of the wars in Ukraine and the Middle East. And I don't know if U.S. forces and South Korean forces are seriously studying those lessons, because it may require a number of steps to adjust our posture there.
Well, I think everybody in the U.S. military is studying the lessons. Whether or not the U.S. military is capable of fielding a drone army or responding to a drone army is another question.
Yeah, that's a good point.
All right, Hak-Soon Paik, the president of the Academy of Kim Dae-jung Studies in Seoul, writes this. Joel, was there any time ever when any U.S. government truly sought to resolve the North Korean nuclear problem by faithfully providing the quid pro quo, peaceful coexistence with North Korea for North Korea's willingness for negotiated resolution by giving up its nuclear weapons and weapons program?
Well, yeah, I know there are a lot of rumors about the Clinton administration and how we reached the agreed framework because everyone expected North Korea to collapse anyway. I never experienced that, but, you know, I wasn't a close advisor of President Clinton. And I do know, because I was involved in implementing the deal, I mean, this was a multi-billion-dollar deal involving a whole bunch of countries, not just South Korea and Japan. And we were very serious about implementing it, very serious. So I look at that period as a time when the United States was very serious. And even if well, let me put it this way. If the deal hadn't collapsed, let's say Al Gore won the election, there was a plan in place to deal with North Korea's cheating. They were doing things with uranium enrichment they shouldn't have been doing. There was a plan in place that would have been implemented to use our leverage to get a better deal. But the Bush administration just ignored it.
Let's go back to the room, right here in the middle.
Hi, thanks, Joel. Mark Goodman, retired State Department. I wanted to ask for your thoughts on how domestic U.S. politics have affected the U.S. ability to make and stick to a deal with North Korea. I'm thinking of a few incidents, like in the mid-'90s when Newt Gingrich took over in the House and refused to fund certain elements for implementation of the agreed framework. And then in the Bush administration, when the battles between the pragmatists and the hardliners several times intervened to essentially prevent a deal, both in killing the agreed framework and in kind of queering the deal right after the joint statement from the six-party talks. Can you say anything about the stability in U.S. policy and whether there's a way to fix that?
Well, in the Clinton administration, you're absolutely right. The Republicans created serious problems for implementation. And they really made us look bad because we had made commitments to the South Koreans and Japanese that we had trouble following through on. But we still moved ahead. We still moved ahead. So by the end of the Clinton administration, despite all the delays in the reactor program, despite all the other problems, we were moving ahead. In terms of the Bush administration, well, the book illustrates this, I think, better than I can. The Bush administration was never seriously interested in following through on the agreed framework. And only during the second term, after the agreed framework had been destroyed by the hardliners, did Bush and Condi Rice decide, well, maybe we do need a deal. And it so happens that during that time period, the hardliners were not as powerful. So, they were severely conflicted throughout the administration. In terms of the Obama administration, I never had anyone I interviewed say to me, gee, we were worried about domestic politics. No one ever said anything about that. In the Trump administration, I think the attitude was, don't worry about domestic politics. Let's just do a deal. So, I don't know. There's no prescription for the future there. Maybe, I don't know what to say. If a Democratic president, if a Democrat wins presidency, how are they going to deal with this issue? I don't know.
Yeah. Another question over here on the on the left side.
Hello, my name is Matthew Rivera. I'm a student at American University. Thank you so much for the talk. It's very excellent. My question is, have sanctions truly played a role in getting a good deal with North Korea? And if not, what is the point of the sanctions?
I have a smile on my face because I'm trying to figure out whether I can say what Rahm Emanuel said.
A lot of bleeps. You're on C-SPAN, so be careful.
Okay, well, I'll be careful. So, when the Obama administration was confronted by North Korea testing the space launch test and the nuclear test, Rahm Emanuel called into his office two senior officials. And, he sort of said to them, I want you to grab Kim Jong-il by the blank. And, so that was his prescription. Well, they didn't do that. So, 3 or 4 years later, the State Department guy who was in charge of sanctions said to me, yeah, we grabbed him by the elbow. And so, I'm very, very skeptical that sanctions can force North Korea to change its national interest. That's just not going to happen. You can put pressure on them. It's going to cost them a lot of money. But they find ways around that, including, even by the Obama administration, they had a global smuggling operation that became embedded in China. So they had all sorts of ways around sanctions.
We have, oh, great. A couple more questions on this side.
Will Faragaro, independent researcher here in Washington. I'm struck by your the description, and I've thought about this with regard to our Korean Peninsula policy before, but how we're stuck in convention. And I'm wondering, there's a certain freedom with an autocrat in North Korea being able to dictate policy. But I'm struck by, and perhaps thinking of leadership's ability to negotiate. I just wondered if you would reflect on kind of, I think you alluded to it, stuck in kind of post-Korean War mentality about for good reason. There are reasons people stick with convention and plans and so on for contingencies. But I'm just wondering in terms of diplomacy, whether we're open to thinking anew and without a failure of imagination? Thank you.
That's a really good question, and if there was anything positive to say about Donald Trump, it was that he was open to imagining a different approach to North Korea. And, when the administration, the first term started, his staff said, we don't want to just conduct these drawn-out negotiations by diplomats. And they even, in the first policy review, raised the idea of a summit. And they knew that Trump, who was trying to figure out what to do about North Korea, I'm not even sure if he knew there were two Koreas. He was trying to figure out what to do, to the point where he even asked Kid Rock what he thought about North Korea. But, leaving all that aside, he was willing to imagine an approach outside the box.
The South Koreans knew that too.
Yes, and President Obama was not willing to imagine that. Certainly President Biden was not willing to imagine it. So it may be that, that's the approach Trump is thinking of taking, but future presidents may need to do that. And it works because on the North Korean side of the ledger, Kim Jong-un is the only person in North Korea who can reach a nuclear deal. All the people below him, they're not going to touch that. So elevating it to that level really could work.
Well, and the president certainly is still willing to do that. Right there in the middle, please. Thank you.
Hi, Ellen Lakeson, Stimson, and George Mason. Joel, I wonder if you could talk about North Korea as a proliferation risk. Over the time period that your book covers, was there a change in attitude about whether North Korea should be helping other nuclear wannabes?
I didn't detect that really. I think the North Koreans have been very careful about this, and I guess it's in their constitution. They want to be seen as a responsible nuclear power, with the one exception, of course, in the Bush administration, when they were caught helping the Syrians build a reactor. There have been reports, and David Albright would know more about this, but there have been reports that at times they may have been looking to sell some nuclear materials to other countries. But beyond that, I haven't really detected a change in there.
Do you think they're not doing it?
Oh, now? No, I don't think they're doing it, but I don't have access to all the information.
We have 2 minutes here, and so I think we do have one last question. Sorry, in the back. Quickly, please.
Thanks. Sharon Swasoni from George Washington University. On this topic of out-of-the-box policy proposals, last week there were press reports that the U.S. is considering renegotiating the nuclear cooperation agreement with South Korea to allow them uranium enrichment and spent fuel reprocessing. This is out of the box because we've had 40 years of policy not to do this. How destabilizing do you think this could be? Because those kinds of technologies basically would give South Korea a latent nuclear weapons capability.
This has been a slow motion policy disaster, namely that South Korea has been on this glide path to building its own nuclear weapons. And we think we're sort of slowing it, we think we're stopping it, but this is the latest manifestation of that. So I don't know, try to imagine a Northeast Asia where North Korea has nuclear weapons, South Korea has nuclear weapons. What's Japan going to do? Are they just going to stand back and say, it's okay? I don't think so. So this is the glide path that we may be on, and what you're mentioning just takes us one more step down that path.
And I talked to officials across the region, some privately, some publicly, who are willing to say, not only do we see Chinese capacity and capabilities increase, but our faith in U.S. security umbrella is going down.
Yeah, and that's another.
And that's not just a Trump thing, by the way. That's
No, that's another element here. You know, it's been going down for a while, and I don't know how many people have seen House of Dynamite, but you know, it's pretty clear there what the dangers are of extended deterrence for the United States.
We are out of time. Joel Wit, thank you very much to everyone online and on TV and in the room, and thanks to you for your fabulous book.
Thanks.
Appreciate it.
Thanks.